Good afternoon. This is Katie Elmore from CIC. Welcome to our summertime cooling webinar. We're going to give folks some time to join before we start. Wow, folks are coming in rapidly. We're at 20. So again, welcome. This is our cooling summertime best practices webinar. So thank you for joining us over this lunch hour. I'd like to remind everyone that we're going to record this session. So if you are trickling in or you need to step away, rest assured we'll have the recording posted later. And if you would like to add any questions during the session, we're going to take time at the end to answer all of your questions. But if you have anything right off the bat, feel free to put that in the Q&A. And I think I will kick this off. I'll give it 2 more minutes, so we'll go till 12:06. Excuse me, if you're just joining us, my light went out. Hang on a second. Heralds of automatic lights. Welcome to the session on best practices for summertime building management. We're going to talk about cooling today. We are recording this session. If you have any questions right off the bat, feel free to put them in the Q&A. I'm going to wait 1 more minute. I'd like to thank the City Department of Buildings, as well as Elevate, for joining us as presenters today, and also Illinois Housing Council, IHC, spread the word about this webinar. So if you heard about it through them, just thanks to them for helping spread the word here. Okay, I think the stream of folks entering is getting slower, so I'll jump in with a welcome and an overview of what we're going to cover today. So welcome to everyone who decided to join us at this lunch hour. We want to educate both building owners and property managers and anyone who is interested in this topic on best practices for summertime cooling. Although we're getting some breaks from the heat this month, it's been a very hot summer, as you know, across the world and here in Chicago. So we thought it was a good time to refresh on summer cooling practices and also give you an update on the Chicago Cooling Ordinance, which applies to only a portion of buildings in Chicago, but we want to make everyone aware of both the ordinance, what buildings it applies to, and how to comply if it does apply to you. And then we've got some general tips and best practices for cooling technologies and funding sources to invest in energy efficiency and make cooling upgrades in your building. So I'm very excited to welcome Grant Ulrich from the City of Chicago Department of Buildings. We'll then have Ken.Parker, my colleague here at CIC. We also have Chris Kaczynski at Elevate presenting, and we'll wrap up with Emily Bloom-Carlin from the Preservation Compact. So before I turn over to Grant, I'll just give everyone a reminder and some background on CIC. We are actually a mission-based nonprofit lender. We were founded in 1974, so we go back quite a few decades. And our mission is to be a leading force in affordable housing through neighborhood revitalization, innovative financing programs, and policy leadership. So we do a little bit of everything, but our focus is definitely on the preservation of rental housing and the preservation of affordable neighborhood housing. And if you want to get into it, we are a CDFI, a community development financial institution. So with that, I'd love to hand it over to Grant, who's going to give us some foundation on why we're talking about cooling best practices and a little bit more about that ordinance that I mentioned. Okay, Grant, I will stop my share and you can take over.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Grant Ulrich, and I am the Managing Deputy Commissioner for the City of Chicago Department of Buildings. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the new cooling ordinance that City Council adopted last summer and talk about how it interacts with the heat ordinance that we've had for a while and what buildings it applies to and what buildings it does not. On behalf of Mayor Johnson and Building Commissioner Matt Baudet, I want to thank CIC for arranging this presentation today, and also thank Elevate for their partnership on helping to roll the heating and cooling ordinance changes out and help educate people about them. We know that there's lots of great things about summers in Chicago, but there's also the heat when we have it. And scientists tell us that climate change is causing the number of very hot days to increase from a recent late 20th century average to around 7 very hot days a year to 36 days a year by 2050. Before I get to the specifics of the cooling ordinance, I want to introduce or reintroduce you to what we do at the Department of Buildings. The mission of the department is to enhance safety and quality of life for Chicago's residents and visitors through permitting, inspections, trade licensing, and both development and administration of the Chicago construction codes. Our department issues between 40 and 50,000 building permits a year, conducts hundreds of thousands of building inspections related to permits, but also business license renewals and 311 calls. And we oversee about 23,000 licensed contractors and trade professionals, plumbing, electrical, general contractors, mason contractors, and so on. The Department of Buildings has just under 300 budgeted position employees. Underlying many of the City of Chicago's climate-related efforts is an attempt to mitigate the impact climate change will have on our residents in an equitable way. Our weather is already getting more extreme, as we've seen this year and last. And while Chicago doesn't have the same wildfire, drought, flooding, and hurricane risks that other parts of the United States do, Chicago does face a significant increase in very hot days. By 2050, the number of very hot days, so days above 92.5 degrees Fahrenheit, is projected to increase from that historical late 20th century average of about 7 days a year to around 36 days a year. That's a 500% increase. The City of Chicago has many interrelated efforts underway for climate change related mitigations, include many that involve the Department of Buildings, but it's absolutely a multi-department effort to both manage long-term preparation and adaptation to extreme heat and manage and respond to extreme heat events as they occur. Extreme heat events kill even more people currently than any other type of weather disaster. And as I said, it's only going to get hotter. So those most at risk in extreme heat events are young children, the elderly, people with pre-existing conditions and disabilities, and those who live alone. I suspect if you're property managers or involved in property management or building ownership, you have at least some residents in one of those risk categories living in your buildings. Unlike preparing for cold weather, which requires maintaining a minimum indoor temperature, preparing for hot weather is a little bit more complex, and creating safe conditions for residents is a little bit more complex. Human safety and comfort in hot weather is influenced by several factors, not just the absolute temperature, factors such as solar exposure, humidity, and airspeed. And different people have different tolerances for heat. A critical factor to improve resident safety, in addition to managing those factors like solar exposure, humidity, airspeed, and absolute temperature, is communication. So check on your neighbors, check on people that you're concerned about. For seniors and other vulnerable residents, the city does offer as a backup well-being checks, so you can find more information about those from the Department of Family and Support Services or by calling 311. Factors that affect human safety and comfort, those include temperature, the absolute temperature, the thermostat measured temperature, but also humidity, sun exposure, airspeed, and activity level. So I think we can all know from experience that on the same day, you're going to feel more comfortable under a tree in the shade with a breeze than you are going to be in direct sunlight running a marathon. So taking all those into account in designing comfort and safety for residents inside of buildings is important. So building adaptations can certainly include air conditioning, but also more passive measures and more economical measures include things like solar control measures, draped shades, blinds, improving insulation and energy efficiency of your building. It's not just for keeping the heat in, it's also for keeping the heat out in summer. Using lighter colored roofing and paving materials during repair and renovation projects. If you have a building that you've done a new roof on, a new flat roof on in Chicago in the last 20 years, you've probably been told that you have to use a lighter colored or more reflective roofing material. That's been a requirement we've had for a while. And then also planting more trees, drought tolerant native plants is definitely a strategy, as well as we move towards relying on things like air conditioning, figuring out your power reliability, whether it's a generator or working with ComEd to bury your electric service lines to make them more resilient in an extreme weather event, a storm or something like that. That brings us to the ordinances that the City Council passed in 2022. One ordinance made some tweaks to the heating ordinance regarding buildings with combined systems that need to transition between heating and cooling mode in spring and fall. And Chris is going to talk about that in detail a little bit later. I'm going to focus mainly on the other ordinance, which I'll call the cooling ordinance. So one thing that the cooling ordinance does is require every new residential building to have air conditioning installed at the time of new construction. I think almost every building, if not every building, was doing that already anyways. I suspect you are most interested about the part that applies retroactively to larger existing buildings. So not all existing buildings, but larger existing residential buildings do have a retroactive requirement. Does this apply to your building? Well, there are three groups of buildings that are subject to the retroactive requirements. The first is high-rise buildings or buildings that are over 80 feet in height. The second is buildings that are not high-rise buildings, but have more than 100 units. And then the third category is housing that is operated as housing for older persons designated under the Federal Fair Housing Act. So most buildings that are operating that way with those different Fair Housing Act rules know who they are because they have that in their leasing materials and otherwise. It does include residential portions of mixed-use buildings that meet any of those requirements. So if your building is in one of those categories, the requirement of the ordinance is not that there be air conditioning throughout, but that the building has the ability to designate and operate a cooling center on certain days when the temperature and the heat index exceeds thresholds in the ordinance. So if your building is housing for older persons, then the ordinance requires all indoor common gathering areas to be designated as cooling centers. For other buildings not housing for older persons, the cooling center requirement is that there be one space designated in the building. The ordinance does not say how big that space needs to be. It does require that space to be available as a backup, as a resiliency measure for those larger residential buildings. The cooling center is not required to be operated if every residential unit has operable air conditioning in the unit, but buildings need to be prepared with a cooling center if one resident's AC is not working. And when do cooling center requirements apply? Cooling center requirements apply on any day when the heat index in Chicago, and the ordinance says that's measured at three places, O'Hare, Midway, or there's a measuring station at the downtown lakefront. If any of those locations exceed 80 degrees, the requirement applies throughout the city. This is usually going to be in summer that we have the heat index exceeding 80 degrees, but we actually had our first day that meets this requirement in 2023 was in mid-April. So it can start early and it can extend later into the year. That's what we're seeing with climate change. And since I'm from the Department of Buildings, I'll remind you that a building permit is required for installation of a permanent air conditioning system. Permits help to protect you and your residents by ensuring that work is done by a contractor who meets certain minimum requirements, including having certain levels of insurance based on the work that they're doing. A permit also entitles you to have the work checked by an experienced city inspector for safety and compliance. So good news is almost all air conditioning installation projects for retroactively installing it in a residential building, including the associated electrical work, are eligible for the easy or express permit processes that we have, which generally does not require architect prepared plans and are generally issued in less than a week, compared to some of our more involve permitting processes that do take longer than that and require more preparation on your end. I'll point you again to chicago.gov/cooling, or maybe for the first time, I'm not sure I said that at the beginning, but chicago.gov/cooling is our resource with all of the information that we're putting out there about the cooling ordinance. I'll also recommend the US Department of Energy resources and US EPA resources about air conditioning and economical air conditioning and other cooling measures that are linked on that page. And then for buildings, as we approach the fall and heat season, our information about our heating ordinance is at chicago.gov/heat. And with that, I will turn it back over to Katie and stop sharing. And Katie will pass it on to our next presenter.
Thanks, Grant. A reminder, if you have any questions for Grant or throughout, feel free to pop those in the Q&A. Next, we're going to hear from Kenyatta.Parker at CIC. And before that, I'll just go back to a little bit more information about the CIC sort of universe. You know, a lot of our clients and those of you who have dialed in today are small businesses and may or may not manage their buildings full time. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context about who we tend to work with. And I do expect that some folks will have a building that requires compliance with the cooling ordinance, but others may not. And so a lot of our clients are in pre-war, that's like before 1942, low-rise buildings. And typically we see central boilers and furnaces, and they may not have AC units at all, which, you know, this is an education session to help you determine whether that's something you need to put in either voluntarily or by requirement. As Grant said, that the cooling center is required, may not be required for every unit in the building. But I also want to say that some buildings that we see have done some energy efficiency. There's a lot of great sort of low-hanging fruit that you can implement, but it takes a little bit of a step, another step forward to make those more impactful energy efficiency measures. So CIC has a history of working in energy efficiency. We've been doing this since about 2008. And our goal, in addition to increasing health and safety, as you know, as cooling implies, we also want to reduce utility bills, increase tenant comfort, and also help your building just be managed more efficiently. So you can increase cash flow through these savings, higher occupancy rates, things like that. So we have, in fact, made 262 energy loans. We've dispersed almost $3 million in grants. And I will say last year, we were happy to be awarded additional grant funding to help building owners with energy efficiency and climate resiliency improvements. So at this time, I'll let Ken go ahead and speak to some of those resources and also the tips for thermal management as we see them at CIC.
Sorry about that, I'm still muted. Hello, everyone. I am Kenyatta.Parker. I'm the Energy Resource Manager here at CIC. Some of the programs that I try and get our clients to get involved with, we have Elevate Energy. Elevate Energy is one of our resources that we send our clients to get started on the energy efficiency get started with energy efficiency for their buildings. We send them over there to get set up for an energy assessment on their buildings. And that way we can kind of get a scope of what's needed inside the buildings. We also have Retrofit Chicago, which is another resource that helps with energy needs on single family and multifamily buildings. Cedar weatherization, it's a staple of weatherization in the Chicagoland area. They handle multifamily buildings as well as single family buildings. So they're mostly handle a lot of the large buildings. Some of the buildings that they've handled, like some of the CHA buildings on State Street, if you're familiar with Chicago, on State Street, the Dearborn Homes, they weatherized and did everything in those buildings. So that's a big accomplishment for them. Here at CIC, we have a few grants that we have for our clients who come in and get loans to purchase buildings do rehab energy efficiency rehabs on those buildings that they purchase. So right now we have what's called the climate energy efficiency grant, which is the ComEd Client Resiliency Grant. That entails of us, on top of the loan that you possibly may receive from CIC, we can help out with some of the rehab things, such as flood proofing, stormwater. We have flood management, stormwater management, backup power, waste management, and we also can help with, if you're interested in solar for your buildings, or if not, we can help out with the community solar program. Our Chase grant is an incentive grant. So if you're really interested in getting into the energy efficiency for your buildings, or you're interested of just getting out there and trying to do your part on the energy efficiency, we have a grant that we can give out to our customers. That's up to $10,000. We can give that out as an incentive for talking to us and getting more involved into the energy efficiency part of your building. There is an energy savings loan here with CIC. So if you come in and you're looking to get a loan for a rehab or purchase of a building, we can add an additional financing up to 90% on your original loan, and that will cover your energy efficiency needs on your rehab. And it also can lower your debt service up to your ratio up to 1.15. Electrification. Electrification is another energy efficiency energy efficient way to make your building safer for you and for your tenants. Electrification. What is electrification? Electrification is replacing all your current HVAC and appliances that uses natural gas. Natural gas, propane, and any fossil fuels, and turning those appliances into use electricity. Eliminating gas appliances reduces air pollutants such as nitrogen oxide and carbon dioxide. And as everybody knows, carbon dioxide is one of the silent killers of all things, especially during the wintertime when everything is closed up and you have your heating systems going. And if it's not checked every year, if it's not properly maintained, it can leak carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is one of the, which has been linked to respiratory issues such as asthma and COPD. When electrification is done, all electric homes should require less total energy and lower your energy bill. There are other things that can be done to assist in lowering your energy bill, and I'll get into those in a few slides. Heat pumps. Oh. Going too fast. Heat pumps. Air source heat pumps is one of the heat pumps that can be used when you're going all electric. It's one of the ways you can reduce your heating approximately 50% compared to your electric baseboard heaters or electric furnace. Heat pumps are efficient electric heating and cooling systems. Some of that, they have been tested in the cold weather climates, especially in the Midwest and the Upper East and somewhere like the Mid-Atlantic. They have those that has been tested to work pretty well, but for the most part, heat pumps works really well in those like southern states that doesn't have the cold climate like we have up here. Solar power. We have for our clients that come in for CIC for loans, we have grant money which is the ComEd Resiliency Grant that can help out if you're interested in getting solar power on your buildings. There are opportunities that with ComEd, you can also go through Elevate that can offset the out-of-pocket costs for the panels or anything to be installed. And there are federal and tax incentives for those who are interested in getting solar. All right, some of the tips then to save energy. Some of these Grant has spoke about before. So if it's, I'll just go over them again. ComEd's peak time savings. This is a program with ComEd that if you ComEd will credit your energy bill on hot summer days when you reduce your energy usage below your recent average using peak saving time hours, summer hours. So between May 1st and October 31st, ComEd will announce those peak saving time hours on the, for most demand. And these days, I mean, at that time, you can lower your temperature inside your home on your thermostat. And for a certain amount of time, usually it's about between 11 and 7 o'clock, 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. and usually 1 to 2 days in the summer. And they'll ComEd will give you those credit back to your bill. They usually announce that either that morning, so you'll be aware that they're going to ask you to set back your thermostat so that you can save money and save energy. Reversing your ceiling fan. This is something that I do at home myself. In the summertime, when you're running your air conditioning, if you reverse your ceiling fan to go counterclockwise, instead of it pushing the air from the ceiling down to the floor, you're actually pulling the air up from your forced air. Usually you're pulling it up so it can circulate throughout the rooms that the ceiling fan is located. And you do the same thing in reverse in the wintertime, so you can push the hot air down so it can be more comfortable in the room. Closing your shades and blinds. In the summertime, that you want to get that solar heat. You don't want that to heat up your room, which is going to activate your air conditioning to cut on. So what you should do is close your blinds so that the solar heat is not coming in and doesn't activate your furnace, and then do the reverse in the wintertime because you want to get that solar heat inside the home. Changing your light bulbs. I know most people have changed their light bulbs to LED because LEDs have become cheaper. But if you still have the old incandescent bulbs, or even some of the CFL bulbs, if you change those bulbs to LED, it doesn't give off as much heat and you'll be saving a lot more energy. So for instance, a 60-watt light bulb, usually with the incandescent bulb, you're actually using all 60 watts. But if you change it out to a LED bulb, which is a 9-watt bulb, you're going to have the same amount of light coming from that bulb, but you're only going to be using 9 watts of energy, which definitely saves you money over time. Some other tips that may not be on there: unplugging your electronic devices that have the little red light on there. So if you unplug those are what's called vampire usage. If you have to get in the habit of changing those, and then that should save you money as well. So that's it for me. My information is on the screen. If you have any questions or concerns, definitely reach out to me and I can try and get you to whatever resources that you may be looking for.
Thanks, Ken. I'll just try to summarize what you presented in terms of these best practices and resources, which is that if you're planning to add cooling, of course, we want to minimize the amount of energy that's required in your building or your home. So, those things like closing the blinds, helps keep the heat out, but also insulating and doing these energy efficiency measures means that when you add that cooling load, you're not overtaxing your utility bills themselves, or the systems in your building. So that's why we really focus on energy efficiency and provide resources. And there's a lot of different programs that Ken spoke to, and some of them will work for your building and some of them won't. And that's why we have his contact information so you can contact him and figure out where you should go for these services. So next I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who's going to talk about an energy system that you may or may not be familiar with, but really pertains to the cooling ordinance. So he's going to speak to how to manage that system under the new requirements should they apply. Chris, I'll let you go ahead and start your video and take it away.
All right. Does everyone see my screen?
Yes. Oh,
Okay.
no, actually, no screen. We see you.
Okay, that's not good. Okay, sorry.
Yep. There you go. Just do the slideshow and perfect.
Very good. All right. So today I'm going to talk about, I got to minimize this. I'm going to talk about two-pipe heating and cooling systems. These are systems that have been around for a long time. A lot of different residential buildings use them, but essentially they allow for heating and cooling only one or the other, so not simultaneously. So newer buildings have 4-pipe systems where some areas can get where hot water can circulate or cold water can circulate, and so which is great. But in these systems, only one or the other can occur, and so the reason why we're talking about this today is because the cooling ordinance and the heating ordinance both apply in some of the transition months between the heating season, cooling season, and the cooling season and heating season. So the question becomes, how can we try to switch back and forth between these modes if we have a 2-pipe system? Traditionally, it would be, you would switch over from one mode to the other, and then that was it. You couldn't go back and forth. So we look for some ways that we could accelerate that transition back and forth and make it easier. So that's what we're going to discuss today. So some folks might know whether might have these systems, and let's kick on. So the following sections are important if your building type meets the criteria defined under the cooling ordinance. And Grant already listed those. I'll show it on the next slide, but basically it's the 80-story building or higher, 100 units or more. And then I think the third one is, yes, operated as housing for older persons under the Federal Fair Housing Act. But there's additional reasons why you'd be interested in the information I'm going to present. And that's because the second criterion that would be important is that your building does not have a common space that can accommodate the building tenants, or you do not plan on providing cooling to a common space. So in that case, you'll need to, you'll be providing cooling, and you'll be providing cooling to all the tenant spaces instead of dedicating one area of the building as a common space for cooling. And then the third criterion is the building uses a 2-pipe water distribution system, as I stated before. So there's some limitations there, and so we'll go over that in a quick second. All right, so these are just the cooling ordinance requirements, so I just went over those. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm not going to read off this slide, but I'm including it because I believe these slides are going to be provided to you. I'm saying that, I'm not exactly sure, but I hope they are. And this has like the specific requirements for meeting the cooling ordinance, with particular focus on those transition months between September 15th and October 15th, and May 1st and June 1st. And what the minimum or maximum indoor or outdoor or minimum maximum space temperatures have to be for given hours of operation. So I'm including this here for reference, but I'm not going to go over it because there's a lot to explain, and I only have a certain amount of time to present this information to you. So 2-pipe water distribution systems, basically, they're exactly what they sound like. You basically have a supply line going to the, and I hope you can see my cursor. You have a supply line going to the water, which supplies either cold water or hot water, depending if it's summer or winter, or heating season or cooling season. And then you have a return line. And depending on how you're operating the system, it's either connected to the boiler system, the hot water system, or the chilled water system. And so there are some valves and pump switchovers that are made depending on the time of year to basically put it into heating or cooling mode. And sometimes that's done manually. Sometimes, there's an automated system to make the switchover happen. So the problem is that we want to keep occupants comfortable and safe and follow these ordinances, but there's some time required to switch over to heating and cooling modes. And so one of the main constraints is that the chillers can only receive water that's below a certain temperature, otherwise it'll cause problems for the chiller, and boilers can only accept water that is above a certain temperature. And so if you're switching over between heating and cooling mode and the water in the distribution system is really hot or really cold, it might cause problems to introduce water that's at that temperature to those pieces of equipment. And so the idea here is how can we quickly, and that's going to depend on your specific make and model. Here I give an example of, the water has to be below 90 degrees before your chiller can accept it. That might be too high for your particular chiller, or your chiller might allow for even higher water temperatures, but that's going to be something that's going to have to be verified on your end, and same with the boiler. And so what we want to do is see how can we bring the water temperature in the system up or down so we get to that set point, or so we get that acceptable temperature, and then we can switch over. So and again, in these shoulder months, we might have to go back and forth multiple times, so this is a concern. All right, so first off, when we're going from the heating to the cooling season, some people had previously misinterpreted the heating ordinance as having that the owner has to provide heating to the spaces during the heating season as defined by the heating ordinance. But really what has to happen is you have to maintain the indoor air temperature to that minimum, which is, I believe, 68 degrees. And depending on time of day, there's some different ranges. But you do not have to keep providing heat to the building when it's 80 degrees outside. That exacerbates the problem. And so one of the first things to do, besides providing the cooling spaces required under the cooling ordinance, is to shut off your heating system. Turn off the heat when it's too warm outside. It seems very basic, but this has been a problem in the past, and so I'm stating it here. So for the cooling ordinance, your building has to be able to provide cooling by May 1st. And so there's typical standard operating procedures that buildings have in terms of preparing some of the equipment that has to be cleaned and prepared for each season, like going from the heating to the cooling season. A lot of time you have to, if you have an open cooling tower, you're filling the cooling tower, making sure you put in the right water treatment, make sure your pumps are working, chemical feed pumps and all those things are working correctly. So those are some things that need to be done before this date. Sometimes if you're running glycol in your system for the heating season, you might have to change over to just using water during that period, because that's usually what people run through their chillers. And then ensuring just that all the pumps that need to run are running, they haven't seized up over the heating season, those kinds of things. So whatever your standard operating procedure is, carry it out before that date so you can ensure that your system can be operational by the time it needs to be. And so that being said, here are just a few ideas of what you can do to try to speed up the heating to cooling transition and cooling to heating transition. And so what this shows here is the supply water temperature of your boiler versus the outdoor air temperature. Now, some folks, and so what this shows is two different ways of operating a standard boiler. This is not a condensing boiler, so you can't provide super low supply water temperatures. You could provide, and some you can provide maybe water temperatures as low as 160 degrees. The reason being is that you can get condensation in the boiler, and unless it's designed to be a condensing boiler, you can start corroding the internals and the heat exchanger of your boiler. So you don't want to do that. So some folks will just run their boilers at constant temperature throughout the year. It doesn't matter if it's minus 10 degrees over in this left end, or if it's 60 degrees outside, they supply 180 degree water. So in this case, let's say we want to transition to this target temperature, which in my example was 90 degrees, so that like the chiller can accept this warm water in the distribution system. In this case, you're going from 180 degrees to 90 degrees. And so you have this 90 degree delta T that you have to somehow bring your water temperature down quickly. One thing you can do in that situation is either if you have an automated system or manually change the set point is as the outdoor air temperature gets higher throughout the season, so you get to warmer parts of the year, reducing the supply water temperature, maybe then again, this is going to depend on your make and model, to let's say 160 degrees Fahrenheit, reduces that delta T down to 70. So it's going to take less time for you to cool that water down. It's still going to take time, but you're reducing it. And so the blue line shows without temperature reset, as it's called. The orange line shows with the reset. So if you look at the legend at the bottom. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is if you have a condensing boiler, you have a significant benefit because you're doing this, let's say in the base case, you were just supplying 180 degree water all the time. And then at 60 degrees, let's say you stop providing hot water. That's your outdoor air lockout temperature where the boiler system's off. In that case, you can do this linear reset where from 0 degrees to 60 degrees, we lower from a supply water temperature from 180 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we see here is that we're going from that delta T of 90 degrees from the base case. Here we have a 30 degree differential. And so this significantly reduces the amount of time it's going to take to transition between heating and cooling mode. So, just as an aside, if you're going to be replacing a boiler from an energy efficiency standpoint and from a heating to cooling transition standpoint, it would make sense to consider getting a condensing boiler. And then on the flip side, we're going from the cooling to heating transition, like let's say between September and October in that time frame. Let's say that we have chilled water being supplied at 42 degrees, which is usually a design supply water temperature for chilled water systems. And that's really only needed at the design outdoor air temperature, which for Chicago, I believe is 96 degrees. But if we don't reset that and we just say, you know what, we're going to provide this 42 degree water all the time, then if our boiler in our example needs 60 degree water for it to safely operate, you don't want it supplying a 42 degree water, you have a 18 degrees temperature difference, and it's going to take a certain amount of time for that water to warm up. However, if you do the same thing and you reset your supply water temperature to, let's say, 50 degrees, when it's a 60 degree outdoor air temperature, then you reduce this down to a 10 degree difference. And again, so you're reducing that transition time. Now, sometimes it's going to have to be done manually, sometimes, but if you're lucky and you have an automated system, that will help speed this up. And the biggest concern for me is if building engineers have multiple buildings where they need to do this, manually doing it and keeping an eye out for changes in weather is probably not going to be practical. So doing this, spending the money to automate this process and implementing the proper controls is something that would be probably not only recommended, but necessary just to make it work, especially if you have a bunch of buildings where you have to do this. And then I'm not going to go over this, but again, since I think this is going to be sent over to folks, I have an example sequence of operations, which defines like the logical steps in operating your boiler, chiller, and the pumps to try to minimize the amount of time that it takes to go between heating and cooling modes. So I hope I didn't go over my time because I don't have a clock in front of me, but yeah, and I know there's a lot of information, but hopefully if you have any questions, I can answer them in the Q&A. And that's it.
Chris. Again, I'll just do my little recap. I think I can't speak to the technical operation of these two pipe systems, but we know that Elevate is a great partner for all things energy and technical related. So between Ken.Parker at CIC and the team at Elevate, if you have a very specific building question or need assistance, these are great resources for you to take advantage of. We are going to save a couple minutes for questions, but I'm going to have Emily Bloom-Carlin, who is with the Preservation Compact housed at CIC, speak to a financial resource. So if you're looking to make any of these upgrades, energy efficiency, or you are making cooling upgrades, or both, hopefully, there's another funding source that you should consider, or this is just, we're spreading the word every opportunity we can about this program. So thanks, Emily, and I will.
Hey everyone, and thanks Katie. I think Katie is going to share the slides. So as Katie mentioned, I'm going to give a really quick overview of a new source of property tax relief. And as a quick note, if you're interested in learning more, we're also hosting another webinar focused on this program on August 24th at noon. So anyway, the Affordable Housing Special Assessment Program is a new property tax incentive for multifamily rental buildings. And this program is administered by the Cook County Assessor's Office, so it's available county-wide, and more than 550 property owners have been approved since it launched last year. And the great news is that the energy efficiency and HVAC improvements discussed earlier on this webinar can help you qualify for the program. Next slide, please. So at its most basic level, this program gives multifamily building owners property tax relief in exchange for investing in their buildings and committing to affordability. So with that in mind, in order to qualify for this incentive, a property owner needs to do new construction or qualifying rehab to a multifamily rental property with 7 or more units, and they need to agree to hold a percentage of their units affordable at 60% of the area median income. If you commit to at least 15% affordability, you can receive a 25% reduction in your assessed value. And if you commit to 35%, you receive a 35% reduction in your assessed value. So you receive that reduction for an initial 10-year period. And as long as you continue to meet the requirements of the program, you can renew for up to 2 additional 10-year terms. So you can receive this property tax relief for up to 30 years total. Next slide, please. So like I said, there are 2 things that an owner needs to do to take advantage of this incentive. You have to commit to affordability and invest in your property. And so I want to talk about the investment requirement first. So meeting the investment requirement for the program through new construction is pretty self-explanatory. You need to build a new building, but to meet the investment requirement through rehab, you need to invest in at least 2 building systems and meet investment thresholds of either $8 per square foot or $12.50 per square foot, depending on which level of property tax relief you select. And these investments can be all sorts of things, including, but really not limited to, doing the energy efficiency upgrades or retrofits that Grant, Christopher, and Ken discussed, replacing major building systems, for example, the roof, plumbing, electrical system, or HVAC system, making health and safety improvements, making accessibility improvements, and lots more. So next slide, please. Next, affordability. For the purposes of this program, an affordable unit is one where the tenant earns less than 60% of AMI, and the tenant's portion of the rent is affordable at 60% of AMI. So as you can see from this table, market rents in lots of neighborhoods are naturally at or below 60% of AMI. And the good news is that even if your rents are above those levels, you don't necessarily have to artificially lower them, right? You can also qualify by renting to tenants with vouchers or by participating in a pretty wide array of income-based subsidy programs. Next slide, please. And as a quick note, you can of course qualify based on work that you're planning right now, sort of future work. But if you've done work since 2015, which is a huge look back period, or you're a current participant in the Cook County Class 9 program, you can also qualify on those bases. So next slide, please. So how do you apply? Well, the application and annual compliance processes are really simple and they can be completed online, which is great. So there's an initial online application on the Assessor's Office website, and we'll drop a link into the Q&A or chat if folks are interested in seeing that. And then once you're approved, you need to submit an annual affidavit. So you submit this affidavit each year to prove that you're still complying with the program's rules. And so that's a really quick overview. As I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to learn more about the process for qualifying or applying for this incentive, we're actually hosting another webinar on August 24th, and that will be circulated as part of the follow-up as well. The great news is that webinar will be hosted in partnership with the folks from the assessor's office who administer this program, and they'll be able to share more detailed information and answer any questions folks might have. And with that, I think in the interest of time, I'll hand it back to Katie. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Emily. I'd like to invite all the panelists to come back to your video. And let's see. So Kristen Culp has a question. I'm going to try allowing you to talk, Kristen, if you're prepared to answer that question or ask that question out loud, or just type it in the Q&A. Yeah, Kristen, if you're there, we're ready. And if not, oh, okay. Kristen.
I was
I
just gonna say that offer a contact for the multifamily portal.com in conjunction with what Ken was talking about for energy efficiency measures that Elevate offers. That's all. And then my question was for Chris as well. So for the measures for the heat pumps, I was trying to understand from a general perspective, but is it a excuse me, an energy saving measure to pretty much either lower or raise the temperature of the water in seasons where you're not using those temperatures to the degree that they are automatically set to? Does that make sense? I'm not sure.
Sorry, this question is for me?
Yes,
Okay, but so I didn't talk about heat pumps. I was talking about boilers.
boiler.
But
yeah.
yeah, it is an energy savings measure as well. So I did it in the context of being able to switch over between systems. But yes, it's a historically very standard energy savings measure. So there's that benefit as well.
Thanks. That's all.
Thanks, Kristen. And Kristen, I know she's with Elevate. So thanks, Kristen, for tuning in and asking your question. I do see there was another question in the chat about condo associations. And yeah, so I think, Emily, were you able to answer the question? I think this pertains to the tax incentive program.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was for the tax incentive or about energy efficiency options. So unfortunately, right now, the property tax incentive only applies to buildings that are multifamily rental buildings with 7 or more units. But I do think there are opportunities to talk about options for property tax relief for condo buildings as well, but there isn't anything yet.
Okay, and if it was about other programs, I know that some of the energy efficiency programs from the utilities, including ones that Elevate works with, that some of them apply to condos and some don't. So that's why we kind of send folks just to a central point of contact to work that out. So with condos, sometimes you can do energy efficiency in common spaces, and there's resources for that. And then in the units, it's a separate process. Ken, I'm going to ask you to answer this question about CIC programs being combined with offerings from other agencies.
Yes, that we can offer our funding as well as the funding you get from third-party agencies. You can combine those. So what'll happen is, the money that you will get from the third party, we can kind of offset what's won't be covered, what they won't cover. So we can try and cover the other portion of that for you, or whatever energy efficiency rehab or whatever you're planning to do inside the building.
Great. Emily, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and one thing I did want to note about the property tax incentive, and we've had folks qualify on this basis, is that, you can qualify on the basis of work that you're doing that's grant funded. The investment doesn't have to come out of your own pocket as long as the investment is meeting those grant thresholds, whether it's coming from your own cash, whether it's coming from a loan, whether it's coming from a grant program. All of those investments can count toward that, hitting that investment threshold for the property tax incentive.
Great, that's really good to know. Okay, now the questions are coming in. I don't want to take people too far over the hour. So I'll just see if we can squeeze a couple more of these in. First of all, logistics, we are going to send out an email with a link to the recording and a selection of the presentations. I think we'll get Grant and Chris's out. Otherwise, you can contact us for more information. Do you have any tips for building owners to encourage tenant cooperation in reducing energy consumption for cooling? I'm not sure that I do. I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that question. I think, yeah, Ken?
Well, that's a hard one because that comes in with behavioral changes. I think if you, as the owner of a building and you talk to your tenants, I think just the repetition of you keep saying it over and over again to them, eventually it'll stick. And they'll, become aware of what they're doing. For instance, like closing the blinds when the sun is on, the east facing wall, and then turning off lights when you're leaving the room. But if you kind of just keep hounding them about it and talking to them about it, and then eventually they'll get it and they'll start practicing it in their homes.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think property management is obviously an art, and I will say that we are going to launch a new round of property management training courses this fall. So it's a great time to network with other property owners and get their best practices, and also learn more about tenant relationships. So look for that in the fall. Chris, did you want to add something?
Yeah, so what I'm going to recommend is it's moderately behavioral, in that you are, if you have thermostats that are controlling the space temperature, one option is to have thermostats that you can allow for a range of set point temperatures. So it gives them some control, but there is a lockout that they can't go above or below a certain temperature. So they get some choice in temperature without setting it super low or super high, so that you can at least control temperature that way. But so it's a little bit technical, a little bit behavioral, but hopefully it makes them happy while controlling energy costs.
Great. Okay, it is just at the hour. If anyone on the panel wants to add a final closing thought, go for it, and then I'll just I'll close the session.
Stay cool and save energy.
Thanks, Ken. Perfect recap. Okay, we will, I think I can speak for myself at least, very much available for follow-up questions. We'll send out some materials. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, thanks to Grant at the city, Chris at Elevate, Emily at the Preservation Compact, and of course, Ken at CIC. So we'll see you all soon at the next webinar on August 24th. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.